I think just generally the path to leadership should not be through, basically MBA business school situation. It's like, it should be kind of work your way up, do useful things, and and there's a bit too much of somebody goes to a high-profile MBA school and then kind of parachutes in as the leader, but they don't actually know how things work. They could be good at, say, PowerPoint presentations or something like that, and they can present well, but they don't actually know how things work because they do not, they parachute in instead of like working their way out.
They never went through an apprenticement, for lack of a better word.
They're kind of like just not aware of what's really needed for to make great products. So, I mean, I don't want to trash MBAs too much here, and I actually do have a dual undergrad, Wharton undergrad, and physics at UPenn. So. So I have I have direct exposure to business school, and I went to do undergrad business school with physics. But and I was a teaching assistant for 2 semesters, and I graded MBAs and undergrads. But I think it's just a little bit too much. Like people look at MBA school as like I want to parachute into being the boss instead of earning it, and like I don't think that's good.
Drew's gonna kick us out this time. Here we go.
Yeah, so I think what Elon is saying is like a lot of times you've got kind of like MBAs who specifically come in who are looking to get a leadership role. A lot of times they just don't simply have they have the high level business acumen of like understanding a P&L and things like that, but they don't necessarily truly understand what is going on in a particular organization, especially like obviously Elon with Tesla and SpaceX are very engineering-centric organizations. So if you aren't fully in accordance with the engineering that goes behind product development and things like that, it's hard for an MBA to come into that type of environment and truly understand what's going on. And what Elon's saying is like, take the time to understand how the machine works and how things are actually designed and developed, and work your way up and demonstrate through the activities that you're doing that you're leadership capable, as opposed to feeling like you need to go out, get an MBA, and then parachute in to an organization to be the leader. A lot of times having that practical experience can give you a considerable edge in just understanding how things work.
That's what I was feeling. I was hearing the same thing.
The random in the middle. Amen. Okay, let's go.
I'm just saying. I was when I was listening to that, as Drew, expounded on it. To me, I was hearing Elon is valuing practice or being practical over theory, experience over education. Like really doing the freaking work, because how else you gonna understand what you're doing unless you get out there and actually do the work? So he was going beyond the book smarts and like get out here in the real world. And get into the trenches and do it and earn the leadership role. Not someone just give it to you because you have a piece of paper. Earn it, because when you earn it as a leader, you can have more empathy and more sympathy and more understanding with the other people that you're leading go through. And so you just gotta really get out here, and there's no substitute. You gotta do the work. And I think that's what he was saying on a practical level.
I'm gonna take it in a few ways and see if these guys wanna chop it up. First off, for the MBA thing, when people ask me, should I get an MBA, or even should I go to college or university in the first place, I think your actions need to map to your ambition. So what do you want to do with your life? And in some roles, having an MBA is really, really, really important. And in others, it's not. So if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you're watching this video and you want to be an entrepreneur, having an MBA is not going to help you. Being in college is not going to help you. Nobody has ever asked me, what college should I go to? Do you know if I went to college? I mean, I did. I went to University of Toronto, but it hasn't served me at all. Now, I don't regret going. At the time, it was my backup plan, and I didn't know that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Entrepreneur wasn't even a thing at the time. So I don't regret going, but if that's your ultimate ambition, then yeah, being an MBA or going to university is probably not going to help you. But if you want to be a doctor, you better go to school. You're not going to have much luck as a surgeon if you're self-taught, right? So that's just on the MBA, college side. Next is, in terms of earning it, that's really in the eye of the beholder, I think. So if you look at Elon, this is somebody who really values the technical engineering side of the business. And so earning it in whoever you're trying to pitch and present to, and if you're an entrepreneur, you got to earn it then with your customers, they will value different things. So some people really value the engineering part of things and completely disregard the business process, the marketing, the sales, the raising capital. And other people, they really value the branding and the marketing and the salesmanship of it, right? And so that just gets down to knowing who your audience is, or in entrepreneurship, knowing who your customer is, and it doesn't have to appeal to everybody. If you're gonna be selling to an Elon Musk, you better know the specs, of your product. But when I was in, my first company was biotech software, and my biggest fear was, I'm 19, I don't know anything about science, it was my worst subject, I'm not the programmer, and I was afraid to get on calls and talk to people because I thought it would be exposed, because I didn't know enough about the product that my partners built and they were the experts. What I realized when I was talking to a lot of these people at the labs, our customers, they actually didn't even know all the details either, and they didn't want to talk about all the details of how their product was made. They wanted to talk on the business side of things, which I could really help and do. When I talked to media about our story, they didn't care about how our product was made. They cared about the story that I was helping wrap things in. And so I was actually underselling my own ability on the sales and marketing and branding and storytelling because I didn't know enough about the product knowledge. So it's not that one is right or wrong, it's knowing who your customer is, knowing who your audience is, and making sure that you are being their chief goal officer. Right? Understand what they want and see if you can give it to them. And then the last part is just around leadership. And this was an interesting point where I don't think earning it on the technical side prepares you at all to be a leader. The fact that you have product knowledge and how something is built and made does not give you any background in actually helping train people. And I don't think we go to school to learn how to be a leader or train people. You might have got it if you were in organized sports and you happen to have a great coach, in your school who was teaching you. Maybe you went to the military and you got out of that, or maybe you just got the good fortune of being in the corporate world and had a great boss who taught you. But where do we learn leadership skills? There's so many people who are great at a skill set who then get promoted to be a manager and then hate their life because now they have to manage people instead of managing process or product, and they really fail and they struggle. And so one, that's self-awareness of you. Do you want to be a leader? Do you want to manage people? Do you like the idea of managing 100 people or 5 people? Or do you like just being a solo person yourself? And that's cool, that's all you're doing. I like investing into people. I like managing people. I like seeing them grow and learn and get better. But that may not be something that you really want to do. And if you do want to do it, then it's changing your skill sets to be able to learn, how do I work with people, manage them, guide them, going to courses and training and reading books and being around people who are doing it. Because learning more about the product or the thing that you're selling, I don't think positions you at all to be a great leader for the people who are managing that product. I talked a lot. What do you guys got?
That's good though. I like the process. I like what he said about know what you like to do. Do you like leading people or product or process? And that's something you have to make up for yourself. You gotta know what you really like doing. And if you're gonna deal with people, well, you gotta have a lot of patience. There'll be a lot of patience, a lot of empathy, a lot of compassion, a lot of understanding, and great communication skills. And that includes listening skills.
Amen.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there.
Our primary goal is to create the technology necessary to get people to Mars, in the absence of which, it's somewhat academic. So we don't want to get too distracted from our primary mission of we got to make it at least possible to go to Mars, and we want to do so as soon as possible and make access to Mars as widely available as possible, as affordable as possible, so that if somebody wants to go, they can. So that's our primary mission. I mean, there are many good causes in the world, but we got to be careful that we do not try to take on too many. I mean, there are many noble missions, but we have to pick our battles and say, okay, let's just make sure we get this done, and because nobody else is doing it. And I mean, if SpaceX doesn't do it, I'm not sure how it will happen. I think this is at least right now, SpaceX is the only hope. So we've got to get this done, and it's far from done. I mean, we've got a long way to go. Yeah. Starlink, in terms of providing internet connectivity to people that really don't have it or it's very expensive, I think will be helpful in empowering a lot of people who are disempowered today. So I think that's a good thing too.
I mean, I'm generally of the view, philosophically, that it's better to be optimistic and wrong occasionally than pessimistic and right. I think you want to look on the bright side of things, and I'm a little worried that young people today maybe sometimes are a little pessimistic about the future, but I'd like to just assure people that so long as we are not complacent, we will solve the climate crisis, and we will solve these issues. We obviously need to take them seriously and work hard to solve them. They will be solved, and that people should be optimistic about the future and work to make that optimistic future real. You know, they say the best way to predict the future is to create it. And so if you take the actions necessary for there to be a good future, then we will have a good future. So I'd encourage people to be optimistic, take the actions that will create a good future, and we will have one.
What was going through your mind? How amazed were you to see your Roadster up there with Starman just cruising along with the blue planet? And how long will we be getting live views, do you think, from the car?
Well, I think it looks so ridiculous and impossible. And you can tell it's real because it looks so fake, honestly. We'd have way better CGI if it was fake. And you know, the colors all look kind of weird in space. There's no atmospheric occlusion. Like everything looks too crisp. But we didn't really test any of those materials for, is it space hardened or whatever, So it just has the same seats that like a normal car has. It's just literally a normal car in space, which I kind of like the absurdity of that. And if you look closely, on the dashboard, there's a tiny Roadster with a tiny spaceman. So, because Hot Wheels made a Hot Wheels Roadster, and a friend of mine suggested, hey, why don't you put that Hot Wheels Roadster with a tiny spaceman on the, in the car too? I'm like, that'd be cool. Sure. So we did that. I mean, it's kind of silly and fun, but I think that's, silly, fun things are important. And normally for a new rocket, they'd launch like a block of concrete or something like that. I mean, that's so boring. And I think that's just the imagery of it is something that's going to get people excited around the world. And it's still tripping me out. I mean, I'm tripping balls here. I think AI safety is a really big deal. And we should have some regulatory agency that is overseeing AI safety. But there is not yet currently any such thing. And just generally any kind of regulatory agency done by the government usually takes years to put in place. After the population collapse issue, I think AI safety is probably the second biggest threat to the future of civilization. Yeah, like I said, I'm not quite sure what to do with it. I mean, Tesla is arguably the world's biggest robot maker, because like we have basically semi-autonomous cars that will ultimately be fully autonomous. And we are building a humanoid robot that will be basically like the car, but with legs. And I kind of held off on doing that for a while because, you know, I certainly don't want to hasten the AI apocalypse. But clearly, with you look at Boston Dynamics, and like those humanoid robots are going to happen. So they're either going to happen with or without Tesla. So it's like Tesla got a little bit more, I mean, a lot more ability to ensure robotics safety and AI. And I'll try my best to do that.
My question is about failure. So I was just wondering, what are you trying at the moment, or what do you think you'll attempt in the future that you're not expecting to succeed at?
Well, I think I'm going to stay on electric cars and rockets for a while, yeah, it was actually never my intent to run Tesla. I kind of, because running two companies is quite a burden, actually. You know, it's sometimes I run into people who think, oh, if you're CEO of the company, then they sort of imagine themselves, if they were CEO of the company, they would grant themselves lots of vacation and do lots of fun things. And it's like, that doesn't quite work that way. What you actually get is a distillation of the worst things going on in the company. It's like, anyway, so the idea of taking on something more is very frightening. But I mean, possibly at some point in the future, certainly not the near term, there are. I think there's an opportunity to create an electric jet, essentially, and I do think one could create an electric jet that is really exciting. Something that would be supersonic, vertical takeoff and landing, pure electric, and just a big leap forward. I think that's a distinct. I'm quite confident it's doable, provided that there's a rough doubling of the energy density in batteries or capacitors. So, you know, basically around the 500 watt-hours per kilogram level is where it starts to make sense. And then there's, I do think there's the possibility of kind of a fifth mode of transport, which I've talked about, kind of mentioned tangentially, which is like I call kind of the hyperloop, you know, I'd like to sort of publish something about that maybe in the next month or two, once Tesla's at steady state production, and I want to flesh it out a little bit so that and pre-address some of the rebuttals that people will come up with, rather than just sort of put it out there and then have the rebuttal occur and have an unaddressed rebuttal. But I guess a way to think of it is it's like a cross between a Concorde and a railgun.
Suppose to be 20 years old right now, where would you start your path from?
I mean, if I was literally just, if I was just a 20-year-old right now in 2021, if I was 21 in 2021.
From where would you start?
Well, I mean, assuming that I'm still a technologist, then I think there's a lot of opportunity in synthetic RNA. The vaccines that were developed, apart from the ones that were done by BioNTech and Moderna are really the beginning of what I call digital medicine, where medicine is software. And I think that's, I would say, what's the single biggest opportunity I see right now? It's probably synthetic RNA and the potential for revolutionizing medicine in that way. There's also artificial intelligence. There's one of my favorites which is tunnels. We need a lot of tunnels to address the traffic in major cities. And then there's obviously the continued electrification of transport with aircraft and boats, in addition to cars. Let's see. There's many other things that will come up as well. So I think we live at a very exciting time. If you look at the whole history of the world and humanity, this is a time of the greatest technological growth in history, and it seems to be accelerating.
There was a bunch of very misleading stuff that was published by ProPublica, and really that was some sort of trickery, and really they did themselves no good service by doing that. So first of all, with respect to the government contracts that SpaceX wins, our aspiration is to do the most for the least. And if you look at all the contracts we've won them because we're the best price. We have a better service at a lower price. They weren't just handed to us.
I don't think they were. And that's what I'm saying. In fact, you called me and said, we finally got in after years of sort of this backslapping. I think it's a great thing. That is a great thing.
Absolutely. I mean, for the lunar lander, just taking that as one example, our bid was half the price of the Blue Origin Lockheed bid, half. So for a vehicle that does basically 10 times more or 8 times more perhaps, our price was half.
Okay.
And NASA has a mandate to get back to the moon, so we saved taxpayers like $3 billion relative to that contract. So I think that's a good thing. There's sometimes a debate about going to Mars one way and whether that makes things easier. And I think for the initial flights perhaps, but for long term, to get the cost down, you need the spacecraft back. Whether the people come back is irrelevant. But you must have the ship back because those things are expensive. So anyone who wants to return can just jump on. So that's. But until a few years ago, I wasn't sure that success was one of the possible outcomes, and now I'm quite sure that success is possible. Of course, there's a long way between possible and making it real, but I believe it is possible. The source of my inspiration, I'd say, is somewhat philosophical. So I think the thing we should be aiming for is increasing the scope and scale of human civilization so as to best ask the right questions for the answer, which is reality or the universe. And so if you accept that premise, then we should work to ensure the long-term survival and prosperity of humanity, of consciousness, and we should seek to extend that consciousness beyond Earth to other planets, eventually other star systems. That is the nature of my philosophy.
He did one great tweet about time, saying time is the currency, which I thought was beautiful.
Time is the ultimate currency, yes. No matter what resources you have, you can't wind back the clock.
It's true.
Yeah. Going into the future, our goal with Tesla is to keep refining the technology, increasing the scale of production, and make a mass market electric car that almost anyone can afford. That's step 3 on the strategy. So step 1 was
high price, low volume. Step 2, mid price, mid volume. Step 3, low price, high volume. So we're sort of at step 2, and now we want to progress to step 3 as soon as possible.
There's another important principle, which is that you really want everyone to be chief engineer. So that everyone is chief engineer means that people need to understand the system at a high level to know what they when they are making a bad optimization. It's like when they are say, like this, we've done this many times where we've put immense effort into reducing the engine mass, but hardly any effort into reducing propellant residuals, or order of magnitude less effort into reducing propellant residuals, and then you land with a literal ton of unused fuel.
What is the one thing that has surprised you about your life?
Oh, one thing, wow. Well, I'm surprised by the whole thing, honestly. I certainly didn't expect for any of these things to happen, honestly. Yeah. I just knew, I knew I wanted to be involved in technology. In fact, the only reason I started a company back in '95, an internet company, was because I couldn't get it. There were only a few internet companies, and I couldn't get a job at any of them. So I tried to get a job at Netscape, and sent my resume in and tried hanging out in the lobby, but I was too shy to talk to anyone. And then I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll have to start a company because I can't get a job anywhere.
Here's another question from a Tesla owner. Why is there no coat hook in the back?
Yeah.
He or she says, you can design a rocket, but you forgot the coat hooks?
Well, I didn't actually forget it. I intentionally didn't like it, so I didn't put it there. The aesthetics of it really bothered me, but and I know, obviously some people disagree with that decision, but I think we might have a retroactive fix for that if somebody has the panoramic roof, which is to basically have a hook on the bow section in the middle of the roof, and then your coat could hang down in the second row passenger footwell, which is actually slightly better than having a coat hook that's stuck on the side of the car. So I think we'll probably do that. Yeah. It sure is important to get the rules right. It's sort of, in terms of legislative and executive actions, it's sort of like, think of, say, like professional sports or something. If you don't have the rules right, if there isn't, if the game isn't set up properly, it's not going to be a good game. So it's real important to get the rules right. Now, I think it's worth noting that I think still in the United States the rules are still better than anywhere else. It's very easy to put something in place which is an inhibitor to innovation without realizing it. So in terms of the regulatory environment, it's always important to bear in mind that regulations are immortal, and they never die unless somebody actually goes and kills them, and then they get a lot of momentum. So a lot of times regulations can be put in place for all the right reasons, but then nobody goes back and gets rid of them afterwards when they no longer make sense. And there used to be a rule in the early days when people were concerned about automobiles, because that was a pretty scary thing to see a carriage just going wrong by itself. Mm-hmm. You never know what those things might do. So there were like rules where you had to, in a lot of states, where you had to carry a lantern in front of the automobile. It had to be like 100 paces ahead of the automobile. There had to be someone with a lantern on a pole. I'm like, okay, but you should really get rid of that regulation. And they did, because it would really be awkward. So just regulations, even if done correctly and being right at the time, it's always important to go back and scrub those, periodically to make sure they're still sensible and they're still serving the greater good.
the proposed Mars expedition, how exactly do you plan on making it cost efficient?
Sure. Well, now that is indeed a tricky problem. I mean, I feel reasonably possible that that success is at least one of the possible outcomes. This is pretty important when you're trying to do something. It's like, well, can that be one of the outcomes? I wasn't actually confident about that until a few years ago. Now, I'm not saying we will get there, but I'm confident that it is at least possible. And the key to that is having a fully reusable Mars transportation system, so that all you're replacing between flights, maybe apart from minor maintenance, is the propellant. I mean, reusability is so fundamental to having a major change in space flight. It would be difficult to overstate its importance. But I mean, I think with analogy to other modes of transport, you can imagine that if airplanes could only be used once, very few people would fly, because it would be super crazy expensive. I guess like a 747 costs $250 million. You'd need 2 of them just for a round trip. But people are not paying $500 million to fly back and forth to London. And that's because you can use a 747 like 20,000 times. And for a rocket, a Falcon 9 rocket costs about $60 million to build. And so if it can be used once, obviously that's a $60 million capital cost. But if it can be used 1,000 times, then it's only a $60,000 capital cost. And I mean, that is, it is the fundamental difference. So you have to have fully reusable, then you have to make sure that the propellant used is as low cost as possible. So our next generation rockets will be using methane as a fuel, which methane is the lowest cost source fuel on the planet, by a good margin. So, and so I think if your propellant costs are low and the system is fully reusable, then I think it should be possible to move to Mars for less than $500,000, which I think is an important threshold, because if people can sell all this stuff on Earth and move to Mars, well, and there's enough people who can do that, combined with those who actually want to do that, that's the fundamental thing needed to have a growing colony on Mars. I mean, kind of like the way that the U.S. was, like the early English colonies in America. When it became affordable for people to sell all their stuff in England and move to America, it grew really fast. In the absence of that, it would just require humongous amounts of government support, and I think probably wouldn't result in a self-sustaining civilization. So the economics of it are extremely fundamental. After that third trip, I'd learned a lot more about rockets at that point, and I held a series of meetings, just sort of brainstorming sessions with people from the space industry to try to understand if I was missing something fundamental about the ability to improve rocketry. And this is where I think it's helpful to use the approach, the analytical approach in physics, which is to try to boil things down to first principles and reason from there, as opposed to reasoning by analogy. And the way this applied to rocketry was to say, okay, well, what are the materials that go into a rocket? How much does each material constituent weigh? What's the cost of that raw material? And that's going to set some floor as to the cost of the rocket. And that actually turns out to be a relatively small number. Certainly well under 5% of the cost of a rocket, and in some cases closer to 1 or 2%. And so I call it sort of maybe the magic wand number. So if you had a pile of the raw material, piles of raw materials on the floor, and you could just wave a magic wand and rearrange them, then that would be the best case scenario for a rocket. And so I was able to see, okay, well, there's clearly a great deal of room for improvement, even if you consider rockets to be expendable. And so I think that's what I mean by sort of thinking about things from a first principle standpoint. If on the other hand, I sort of analyzed it by analogy and said, okay, well, analogy would be, well, what are all other rocket companies, what do their rockets cost? What historically have other rockets cost? And that would be sort of an analogy thing, but it really doesn't illustrate what the true potential is. And so I think it's sort of a first principles approach is a good way to understand what new things are possible. So this is a good framework. How do we figure out how to take you to Mars and create a self-sustaining city, a city that is not merely an outpost, but could become a planet in its own right, and for us, thus we could become a truly multi-planet species. Sometimes people wonder, well, what about other places in the solar system? Why Mars? Just to sort of put things into perspective, this is an actual scale of what the solar system looks like. So we're currently in the third little rock from the left. That's Earth. Yeah, exactly. And our goal is to go to the fourth rock on the left. That's Mars. But you can get a sense for the real scale of the solar system, how big the Sun is, and Jupiter, Neptune, Saturn, Uranus, and then the little guys on the right are Pluto and friends. This sort of helps see it not quite to scale, but it gives you a better sense for where things are. So our options for becoming a multi-planet species within our solar system are limited. We have, in terms of nearby options, we've got Venus, but Venus is a high pressure, super high pressure hot acid bath. So that would be a tricky one. Venus is not at all like the goddess. This is not in no way similar to the actual goddess. So it's really difficult to make things work on Venus. Mercury is also way too close to the sun. We could go potentially on one of the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, but those are quite far out, much further from the sun, a lot harder to get to. It really leaves us with one option if we want to become a multi-planet civilization, and that's Mars. We could conceivably go to our moon, and I certainly have nothing against going to the moon, but I think it's challenging to create become multi-planetary on the moon because it's much smaller than a planet. It doesn't have any atmosphere. It's not as resource-rich as Mars. It's got a 28-day day, whereas the Mars day is 24.5 hours. And in general, Mars is far better suited to ultimately scale up to be a self-sustaining civilization. When you hire people, or really what you're trying to, when you hire people, that just means you're convincing people to join you in the endeavor. You should hire people that are also passionate about what you're doing. So it's not just that they're not just there for the salary. They really need to care about what they're doing, and then they will stay during the dark times. After that third trip, I'd learned a lot more about rockets at that point, and I held a series of meetings, just sort of brainstorming sessions with people from the space industry to try to understand if I was missing something fundamental about the ability to improve rocketry. And this is where I think it's helpful to use the approach, the analytical approach in physics, which is to try to boil things down to first principles and reason from there, as opposed to reasoning by analogy. And the way this applied to rocketry was to say, okay, well, what are the materials that go into a rocket? How much does each material constituent weigh? What's the cost of that raw material? And that's going to set some floor as to the cost of the rocket. And that actually turns out to be a relatively small number. Certainly well under 5% of the cost of a rocket, and in some cases closer to 1 or 2%. And so I call it sort of maybe the magic wand number. So if you had a pile of the raw material, piles of raw materials on the floor, and you could just wave a magic wand and rearrange them, then that would be the best case scenario for a rocket. And so I was able to see, okay, well, there's clearly a great deal of room for improvement, even if you consider rockets to be expendable. And so I think that's what I mean by sort of thinking about things from a first principle standpoint. If on the other hand, I sort of analyzed it by analogy and said, okay, well, analogy would be, well, what are all other rocket companies, what do their rockets cost? What historically have other rockets cost? And that would be sort of an analogy thing, but it really doesn't illustrate what the true potential is. And so I think it's sort of a first principles approach is a good way to understand what new things are possible. So this is a good framework.
Why do you think Tesla succeeded, whereas other car companies failed in their methods of electric cars? Like, why do you think Tesla is the leader in this idea?
Well, I mean, there haven't been that many car company startups. I mean, there was sort of Fisker and Coda, and then a few smaller ones, and then the rest has sort of been some fairly small-scale efforts by the big companies. I think if we say what was the difference between, say, Fisker and Tesla, that's maybe the most direct comparison. Tesla is a hardcore engineering company, and Fisker is kind of was based on styling. You know, it's like styling is good, important, but that's not the reason we don't have electric cars. So it's not, but for styling we would have electric cars. That's not the reason. So in the case of Fisker, they made a car that a lot of people think looked really good, but didn't work properly. So then people don't want to buy the car. That's like a pretty reasonable thing, I think. I mean, if you think like what's the point of a company existing? The point is that it's a group of people that have gathered together to create a product. If the product is good, the company should exist, and if it is not good, the company should not exist. That seems like fundamental to the nature of companies. So clearly then one should focus on making the absolute best product you can, otherwise you reduce the probability of success. But a lot of companies focus on things that aren't really to do with the product, as though a company has any basis for existing apart from doing useful things. That's kind of strange. As you recall, the recession was particularly difficult for car companies, and right as in the summer of 2008 we had to raise a big funding round, but because of the collapse in the financial system, that funding round didn't happen, and we had to piece together the money to keep the company going from myself and existing investors, and we were able to just complete a financing round that was just barely enough to keep the company going, and we closed it on the last hour of the last day that it was possible to do so. It was Christmas Eve, 2008, 6 p.m. And after that, the investors would have they were going on vacation, wouldn't have been possible to bring them back to the table, and we would have run out of money a few days after Christmas. So that was also a close call. So while things are going really well these days, I think it's always important to remember that when you're creating a company,
there were very dark times, and it's about getting through those dark times. That's the difference between success and failure.
The proposed Mars expedition, how exactly do you plan on making it cost efficient?
Sure. Well, now that is indeed a tricky problem. I mean, I feel reasonably possible that that success is at least one of the possible outcomes. This is pretty important when you're trying to do something. It's like, well, can that be one of the outcomes? I wasn't actually confident about that until a few years ago. Now, I'm not saying we will get there, but I'm confident that it is at least possible. And the key to that is having a fully reusable Mars transportation system, so that all you are replacing between flights, maybe apart from minor maintenance, is the propellant. I mean, reusability is so fundamental to having a major change in space flight. It would be difficult to overstate its importance. But I mean, I think with analogy to other modes of transport, you can imagine that if airplanes could only be used once, very few people would fly, because it would be super crazy expensive. I guess like a 747 costs $250 million. You'd need 2 of them just for a round trip. But people are not paying $500 million to fly back and forth to London. And that's because you can use the 747 like 20,000 times. And for a rocket, a Falcon 9 rocket costs about $60 million to build. And so if it can be used once, obviously that's a $60 million capital cost. But if it can be used 1,000 times, then it's only a $60,000 capital cost. And I mean, that is, it is the fundamental difference. So you have to have fully usable, then you have to make sure that the propellant used is as low cost as possible. So our next generation rockets will be using methane as a fuel, which methane is the lowest cost source fuel on the planet, by a good margin. So, and so I think if your propellant costs are low and the system is fully reusable, then I think it should be possible to move to Mars for less than $500,000, which I think is an important threshold, because if people can sell all this stuff on Earth and move to Mars, well, and there's enough people who can do that, combined with those who actually want to do that, that's the fundamental thing needed to have a growing colony on Mars. I mean, it's kind of like the way that the U.S. was, like the early English colonies in America. When it became affordable for people to sell all their stuff in England and move to America, it grew really fast. In the absence of that, it would just require humongous amounts of government support, and I think probably wouldn't result in a self-sustaining civilization. So the economics of it are extremely fundamental.
What drives you? What is it that when you wake up in the morning, do you see a problem and you want to solve it?
I think the thing that drives me is that I want to be able to think about the future and feel good about that. So that we're doing what we can to have the future be as good as possible. To be inspired by what is likely to happen, and to look forward to the next day. So that's what really drives me is trying to figure out how do make sure that things are great and going to be so, and that's the underlying principle behind Tesla and SpaceX. Is that I think it's pretty important that we accelerate the transition to sustainable generation and consumption of energy. It's inevitable, but it matters if it happens sooner or later. And then SpaceX is about helping make life multiplanetary and doing what we can to continue the dream of Apollo and ultimately make a contribution to life becoming multiplanetary. I think so when you create a company, I mean, if you think, well, what is a company really? A company is a group of people gathered together to create a product or service, and that's really all a company is. And so you have to really believe in what you're creating, and that and know in your heart and mind that this is something that matters, and that the world ought to have. And I think it's important to investors to show that you're all in. And I think, for example, with Tesla, the fact that I invested all the money I had, literally I had to borrow money from friends to pay the rent in 2008. The fact that I was all in, I think, made a huge difference to investors, to convince them to invest in Tesla at the same time that say GM and Chrysler were going bankrupt. Yeah, I think you have to show that you really care. Like it's like that you've got skin in the game, and that you've given it everything that you've got, and then the other people at the company will follow suit, as will investors. I think that's really important.
Another mistake that tends to happen in production is too much in-process testing. When you're first setting up a production line, you don't know where things are breaking. You don't know where things are breaking, so you'll test work in process at various steps, and because you want to isolate where's the mistake occurring. So a very common issue with production lines is to have is to not remove the in-process testing after you've diagnosed where the problems are. So basically, if you have a very high acceptance, if things are getting to end-of-line testing and are passing, then you don't need to do in-process testing. So, but what tends to happen is there'll be an initial development engineering team that will be basically debugging the production line, but then they will forget to take out the in-process testing steps. So then what happens is the in-process tester will often choke the cycle time, choke the line production time. It'll be like the limiter. It'll also have some number of false positives and false negatives. But I mean, it'll be like false positives, then you're rejecting good parts. Right. Really in volume production, if things are working well, you're really just taking a risk. Will this subsystem be rejected during the production process or at the end? And so you just really want to move things pretty much almost always to just test at the end of the line, and that's it. Maybe there's one or two in-process steps that are hard to test at the end of line, but basically remove almost everything.
An important thing in innovation or trying to create new things is to try really hard to do that, which may sound incredibly obvious, but that's what I find is most often what people don't do. They actually didn't try super hard to come up with something new. And it is helpful to have cross-pollination of industries. I mean, it's been quite difficult to run SpaceX and Tesla, but there has been good ideas. Since I got both in my mind space, this good ideas going back and forth. For example, on the car, with respect to the car, the Model S is the only all-aluminum body and chassis car made in North America, and very few cars are all aluminum. In the aerospace industry, that's the default. So it seemed like obviously the right move in order to minimize the non-battery pack mass of the car. So in order to offset, a fairly heavy battery pack, we had to make the rest of the car light
but still achieve a 5-star safety rating. I don't think it would have been possible to do that if we had used steel, which is the traditional method. And what's helped SpaceX has been that the car industry is really good at making complicated objects at a low cost. I mean, it's actually quite incredible that like one can buy a decent car for $20,000. I mean, all the stuff that's in that car is, I mean, it's nutty how much stuff is in a car. At SpaceX, I hired a bunch of people from the auto industry to run manufacturing, which has worked out reasonably well.
What's the actual biggest failure that you've gone through to get to where you are?
We blew up 3 rockets in the beginning. So that was bad. We actually only had enough money. Originally, I basically took all the money I made from PayPal, put it into SpaceX, to creating SpaceX, Tesla, and Solar City, and initially figured I'd keep half of it, and then I'd spend the other half on these crazy adventures that would probably fail. And then, unfortunately, they needed all the money, so so I had to give them all the money, and then I didn't have a house or I had to borrow money for rent. That was pretty difficult. That was back in 2008. And then we managed to scrape enough spare parts together to do a 4th launch at SpaceX, and that worked. And if it had not worked, SpaceX would have died. Probably would have lacked the credibility to raise the remaining money for Tesla, and we wouldn't be here today. Or maybe it'd be like, not this ending. There's a lot of technical problems to solve. So I guess we sort of, started studying kind of engineering and physics and biosciences and that kind of thing would be the way to go. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of problems to solve to make a city work on Mars. We were thinking of, just as sort of a semi-joke, putting a job description on our website for urban planner in brackets Mars. There's going to be just a tremendous amount of problems to solve. There's just a lot of building and problem solving. So those are like the right, skills to work on if someone's interested in going beyond Earth or space in general. I think like if you're like trying to work on something, and like my experience is like it's really hard to if you're trying to figure out what others love but you don't love it, it's really hard to make that great. So when you work on something, if you fall in love with it, that's a good sign. And then don't worry about if others do. If you do, others will.
Whatever requirement or constraint you have, it must come with a name, not a department. Because you can't ask the department, you have to ask a person. And that person who's putting forward the requirement or constraint must agree that they must take responsibility for that requirement. Otherwise, you can have a requirement that basically an intern 2 years ago randomly came up with off the cuff, and they're not even at the company anymore. Right. But it came from the, let's say, aeroloads department. They're like, actually, no one in the aeroloads department actually currently agrees with that. This is, by the way, happened several times.
So again, it can be literally.
I don't want to put it on the aeroloads department, but there's every department.
First of all, I think that's very exciting and inspiring, and there need to be things that are exciting and inspiring and make you look forward to waking up in the morning. It's like, yay, the future is exciting. This is underappreciated, like tunnels. Sorry, it's like, all right. But there's got to be things that make you excited about life. It can't just be problem solving, one sort of miserable problem after another. It's got to be like, I'm fired up about the future, and here's why. And space is one of those things that does that for people all around the world. When Apollo 11, when they landed on the moon, I mean, that was something for all of humanity. It really was. And people would, if there's like one TV for 50 miles around, people would walk. They'd walk 50 miles just to go find that one TV to watch it happen. Sometimes people think, well, what about the poor nations of the world? They're like, what? It inspires them too. We need things like that.
Woohoo! If you want another amazing Elon Musk video, check it out right there next to us. I think you'll enjoy it. Continue to believe, and we'll see you there.
If you think like, what is education? Like, you're basically downloading data and algorithms into your brain.